Thank you very much, Stuart, and welcome. Good morning, everyone. It's a real honour for me to be here. As Group Chief Economist of BP, obviously, as Stuart was saying, Bryan Lovell had a very distinguished career at BP, unfortunately before my time, so I never had the opportunity to meet him, but before my time, but has close links with BP. And one of the coordinators and conveners of this conference is Heriot-Watt University, and BP and the economics team has a very close relationship with Heriot-Watt University. They work very closely with us, particularly in producing the statistical review. So for both those reasons, I'm very pleased to be here. The thing which I'm more worried about is saying anything about decarbonisation to an audience like you of complete experts. So I'm not going to attempt to say anything on decarbonisation, and as an economist, I'm going to stick strictly to the economics and just hopefully provide a little bit of backdrop in terms of some of the global trends which we're fighting against, as Stuart was saying. The way I think about it is we all face, or the global energy system faces, a dual challenge. We need to produce more energy and less carbon. In terms of more energy, this plot just looks at the relationship between human development as measured by the UN's Human Development Index, and energy consumption. And you can see that increases in energy consumption tend to be associated with increases in human development, with that relationship particularly pronounced for levels of energy consumption up to around 100 gigajoules per head. So for increases in energy consumption up to around 100 gigajoules per head, that tends to be associated with very significant increases in human development. Today, around 80% of the world's population live in countries whose average energy consumption is less than 100 gigajoules per head. Based on sort of just extrapolation of future trends, if energy consumption increases by around a third out to 2040, so increases by about 35% out to 2040, still around two-thirds of the world's population will live in countries whose energy consumption per head is less than 100 gigajoules. The world needs more energy for it to continue to grow and prosper. But at the same time, we need less carbon. These two scenarios are taken from BP's energy outlook, which tries to look at some of the sort of trends going forward. The low carbon scenario here has carbon emissions falling by around 45–50% by 2040, which is pretty much sort of in the pack of external projections which claim to be consistent with keeping temperatures below 2 degrees, well below 2 degrees increase. In contrast, the evolving transition scenario is a sense about what the path the global energy system is on, based on current trends in technology, social preferences and policies, with carbon emissions continuing to edge up in this scenario, edging up around 10% or so. And closing that gap, getting off of the blue line onto the orange line, if you like, is the challenge we face in terms of reducing carbon emissions. We're not on anything close to a path consistent with meeting the Paris climate goals. The good news is, despite Stuart's chart he just showed you, we have been making progress in terms of carbon emission in recent years. So the chart on the left here, the grey line, looks at the growth in carbon emissions each year from energy use, carbon emissions from energy use each year over the last 20 years or so. And you can see in years 2014, 15 and 16, there's almost no growth in carbon emissions. We had 3 years where there's flat to falling growth in carbon emissions, which led a number of people to think, well, at least perhaps carbon emissions have peaked. And at least we haven't yet got the sharp fall down, but we perhaps are starting to a point where that line is starting to bend. Unfortunately, last year, in 2017, carbon emissions rose again. We're trying to understand what's going on. This chart here looks at the growth in carbon emissions in the 10 years out to 2013, and then looks at this very sharp slowing in carbon emissions the last 4 or 5 years and says, what accounts for that, just purely in terms of the arithmetic? What changed to move for carbon emissions from an average growth rate of 2.5% or so a year to slow to an average growth rate of closer to 0.5% a year over in the last 3 or 4 years? What's the factor which counts for that? And it's China. China accounts for the vast, vast majority of that. Some of those trends going on in China are structural, persistent trends as it shifts to a slower pattern of growth, a less energy-intensive pattern of growth, and the shift in the fuel mix away from coal into cleaner energies. Some of those trends are persistent and structural, and so some of this slowing in carbon emissions is likely to persist. But some of that slowing reflects a particular pattern of cyclical downturn that's happening in China at the moment. And so it was pretty obvious that during 14, 15 and 16, some of that slowing wasn't persistent and it was going to start to pick up, and then sure it did, and so it did in 2017. So some progress, but still an awful lot further to go. When you think, well, how do we get off that orange line, off the blue line onto the orange line? Which bits of the energy system do we need to make most progress? In BP, in this analysis in BP, when we said, well, how did we get from the blue to the orange line? The key sector where most progress, where you need to make most progress, is the power sector. That's where any sort of analysis over the next 20 years, if you look at our analysis, I think it's pretty true for the IPCC, the IEA and so on. It's the power sector where we need to make most progress. Why the power sector? I mean, two reasons. One, the power sector is the largest single emitter of carbon emissions from energy use. I mean, it accounts for over a third of carbon emissions from energy use last year. Secondly, the power sector is where fuels compete side by side, literally hour by hour. And so therefore, small changes in relative prices can lead to very significant shifts in the fuel mix. So the power sector not only matters, it's where you get a big bang for your buck. So at this point you think, well, that's okay. It's the power sector. We've been making progress in the power sector. So that's good. I mean, renewables, that's where renewables are growing really strongly, and that shift away from coal, that's where it's going to be. So that's okay, isn't it? No. This is the fuel shares going into the global power sector over the last 20 years. This is not an optical illusion. These are three straight lines. The share of coal in the global power sector in 2017 was 38%. The share of coal 20 years earlier, in 1998, was 38%. The share of non-fossil fuels in 2017 was lower than it was 20 years ago. Yes, extraordinarily strong growth in wind and solar power, but that has not kept pace with the declining share of nuclear and, to a certain extent, hydropower. So the sector where we need to make most progress, we've made precisely none. And so the idea that we can say, well, it's okay, technology is going to do this for us, there's a momentum here. The power sector, the sector which we need to make most progress, we've made precisely none. When we go back and think about, well, what may the energy system look like in this world? Suppose we're successful at getting off that blue line, we get onto that orange line in this lower carbon scenario. What does that lower carbon scenario look like? In this lower carbon scenario, all of the increase in energy over the next 20 years is accounted for by renewable energy. So you need massive growth in wind and solar power, with the share of wind and solar power going up to around a third by 2040. If you look at history and look at the pattern and the pace of energy transitions, for renewable energy to go from essentially the level it is today of 3 or 4% to 30% over the next 20 years is literally off the charts relative to any pace of transition we've ever seen before. Energy transitions typically are measured in many, many, many decades. For something to go from 1 or 2% to 30% would literally be unprecedented. What's striking here, despite all of this strong growth in renewable energy, oil and natural gas, shown by the green and the red bars at the bottom here, still account for well over 40% of world's energy in 2040. In this scenario, consistent with meeting the world's with carbon emissions falling at that point. For oil and gas to be at this level in 2040 would take many, many trillions of dollars of investment between now and over the next 20 years. So to get on a path consistent with meeting the Paris climate goals for carbon emissions to get off that blue line to fall by 45–50%, you would still need many trillions of dollars of investment in oil and gas. And if you don't do that, we're going to fail on the other half of that dual challenge. We're not going to be providing the more energy that we need for the world to continue to prosper. And those 80% of the world's population living in countries not consuming that, very high levels of energy will be stranded there. My final slide, Stuart said, don't make sure you don't speak for too long. My final slide was if we suppose we're successful in getting off that blue line onto the orange line, that would still leave the level of carbon emissions in the world would fall very roughly from about 35, 36 level of gigatons today to about 18 or so gigatons in 2040. You're taking half of them out. That would be amazing progress, but it would still suggest we've got another 18 gigatons to go if we're going to get anything close to Stuart's chart. So what type of technologies and processes are likely to be important here as a way of trying to help set up your discussions for the next 3 days? So first, I think it's the answer is efficiency, efficiency, efficiency. That's the thing which and what I find deeply sort of quite frustrating about the nature of the debate is so often the debate immediately goes into fuel switching. How do we go from one fuel to the other? But the most important thing is efficiency, efficiency, efficiency. Part of that story on efficiency is just using energy more efficiently, improving the efficiency of machines and so on. But also increasingly, I think it's in processes, the so-called circular economy processes of finding better ways of reusing and recycling different types of products. So we reduce the demand for new materials and we reduce the demand for new products. That's the best way in which we can save energy. Secondly, and a key point here will be to decarbonise that power sector more and electrify more and more processes. So a key feature which we're seeing already, we've been talking about electric cars. It's actually 300 million by 2040, not 30 million electric cars, but 300 million cars was the electric cars is sort of the order of magnitude. So decarbonise the power sector and electrify as many activities as we possibly can will be central to that process. When we decarbonise the power sector, that will need an awful lot more renewable energy, supported by different forms of energy storage. Demand-side response will be critical to here, and different forms of grid interconnections. Try all three of those trying to solve the intermittency issue associated with renewable energy. And we will also need more gas and coal, but together with carbon capture, use and storage. So CCUS playing a key role here. We will not be able to, there's a raging debate, but I think most central views is an energy system based purely on renewables is not going to be very likely. There will be a role for gas and coal, but that will obviously need to be supported by CCUS. So the key trend, decarbonise the power sector and electrify as many activities as we can. The IEA, however, recently estimated that theoretically only around 2/3 of final end use of energy can be electrified, suggesting that only 1/3 will need some other forms of processes. So we need some other form of low carbon energy or low carbon energy carriers to solve to decarbonise the system. That means a potentially very significant role for hydrogen, be that either green hydrogen made by renewables with electrolysis or so-called blue hydrogen, where you're using either gas or coal and CCUS to make that hydrogen. A very significant role for bioenergy as well, including liquid biofuels. There are some bits of the world system today which are very hard to electrify, but also hard to use for hydrogen. Aviation is a good example of that. The idea that although electric planes for very short distances are feasible, the idea we're going to have transatlantic electric planes seems at the moment extremely unlikely. It's unlikely we're going to put hydrogen on those planes, and so we need some other source of fuel, so biofuels and bioenergy significantly there. And then finally, that will help to a certain extent, but we'll also need more and more issues associated with carbon storage and removal. CCUS is going to play an increasingly important role, both within the power sector, but also within industry as well. As we go from that blue line to the orange line, we had roughly, in our analysis, roughly about a quarter of the reductions in carbon emissions, about between 4 and 5 gigatons of carbon emissions are captured by CCUS, and we will need a further very significant amount of CCUS if we're going to go from that, if we're going to take out the remaining 18 gigatons or so. And then increasingly, we will need a whole range of negative emissions technologies, especially if we're going to have some carry on some carbon emissions from some forms of energy. We will need to balance those off with different types of negative emissions technologies. That leads us into issues to do with BECCS, air capture, land carbon, which is where I get very nervous because that's where you're the experts and I'm not. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Spencer, for a good overview introduction and, of course, keeping to time. So we've got 10 minutes or so at least for any questions. So there's a couple of roving mics. Who wants to ask Spencer a critical or supportive question? Over there, yep. We only have a mic. Get off.
I'm Luis von Boté, University of Geneva. I'm also a geologist, so my question is I'm not specialist on that. What is the potential for energy saving that BP has calculated, estimated, especially in heating, in housing, because probably this is one of the additional most saving sectors. I'm asking that because exactly in Geneva now we have 2 new professors on energy savings.
So I think it's huge. If you look back about why carbon emissions have fallen. So I have that chart I showed you looking at the 2.5% trend growth we'd seen in in the past, and then that sort of most recent period. And you say, well, one way is to break it down by country, regions, and it was China. The other way is, well, where's it come from? Is it energy efficiency or is it fuel switching? And it's energy efficiency. So over the next 20 years, on current trends, global GDP will more than double. But we have energy demand only increasing by about a third. The difference between the two is energy efficiency. And the reason why I'm so obsessed about energy efficiency is, at the moment, a big part of the debate about energy efficiency is what are other people going to do? What are you going to do about it? I was sitting in a conference in DC in the summer last year, and I made a presentation, and somebody stood up and said, what is BP going to do about it? What are you going to do about this? And the thing was, we were sitting in that room in shirts, jackets and ties. It was over 100 degrees outside with the air conditioning turned up, and everybody thought that was fine. We all thought that was perfectly fine, that we sat there saying, what are you going to do about this, sitting there polluting the atmosphere? And so the key thing about energy efficiency, we need a mind switch here. It's not for somebody else to do, it's for all of us to do in terms of moving energy efficiency. And I think there is enormous potential for that energy efficiency to make. It is, for me, the game changer in terms of getting off that blue line onto the orange line.
Okay, John.
John Midgley, BGS. How do these figures look in the context of world population growth over the next 20 years?
So these build in population growth, but the key thing here, what drives global economic growth over the next 20 years and what drives energy growth over the next 20 years, partly is population growth, but the real driver is increasing prosperity. So you think about China. China will carry on growing over the next 20 years. But its working age population has already peaked. Okay, so the only reason why it can carry on growing over the next 20 years is they become more productive. Okay, economic growth is can only two things can ultimately drive an economy to grow more. They have either more people or those people become more productive. In China, the working age population has already peaked. So all of the growth comes from productivity. If productivity increases, output per head, that also means that prosperity increases, income per head. We think something like 2.5 billion people, so that's a third of the world's population today, will move from low incomes to middle incomes over the next 20 years. That's what drives economic growth. So about 80% of economic growth, most people estimate, over the next 20 years will come from the developing world, the vast majority of that from prosperity. And it's that increasing prosperity, the emergence of a middle class, which drives the demand for energy going forward.
Can I ask a question, Phil Ringrose, Equinor? You made the point that the transformation needed into the future is unprecedented, hasn't happened before. Are you sure? I mean, we had the shale gas revolution in the 80s, which was a dramatic change in energy, and at the beginning of the industrial age, we had dramatic, energy input from combustion of coal. So, are you convinced that we've never done the rate of transition that we will need?
Yeah. So, if you look back in history, it took it took oil something like 45 years to go from 1% of world energy to 10% of world energy. It took natural gas well over 50 years to go from 1% to 10%. To get renewables, it will be shooting through that in something like 20 years. So in that sense, it is literally off the charts relative to the past. Now, part of you say, well, the pace of change is different now. Things will be quicker. But the key thing to remember about the energy system is it's very capital intensive. It's made up of machines and structures that take a long time to sort of gradually decay. An average car lasts for 10 or 15 years. Power stations for 30 or 40 years. And that acts as a natural brake on the pace of change. Unless you're going to scrap those productive assets, which is hugely expensive and economically inefficient, then that capital intensity acts as an inertia and on the pace of change. And if you like, that's one of the challenges. To get quick, rapid paces of change, you either have to scrap those assets, which is expensive, or you need to find ways of pushing things through as quickly as possible.
When you showed the Human Development Index, the peak obviously coming in under 100 gigajoules, just to clarify, if the peak is there prior to that, then that's going to represent a majority of developing countries in that they have a lower requirement per person. Is there much specification as to where perhaps systems can be put in place that developing countries are then shown best practice through BP, perhaps initiatives that you run or opportunities that you give to developing countries? They have the right to develop, but to show them how to do it sustainably and efficiently.
Yes, and a lot of the benefit of these developing countries, they can leapfrog technologies, okay? So none of them will have telephone systems, landline telephone systems. Everybody will just leapfrog in terms of into mobile phones. And so there is a chance of leapfrogging and using energy more efficiently if you can. The key issue here is the nature of urbanization in these economies. So the big associated with that increase in productivity is urbanization. That's how productivity tends to rise. People come from agricultural land, they move into the city, they start to specialise in its urbanisation. And so it's the design of those cities which is absolutely key. And I think one of the issues, BP will try and play a part in that, but I think one of the things, the sort of, if you like, the meta issues going on now is thinking about the design of smart cities and urbanisation in developing Asia and Africa, and that will be key to thinking about increasing prosperity, but also increasing that prosperity in a way where you can use energy efficiently. And so, I mean, I'm sure many of you travel. You can go to some countries in Africa where they're doing that in a smart way. You can go to other parts in Africa, and the sort of the generic one at the moment is urbanisation in Africa is not being done very smartly, and as a result of which productivity levels aren't growing to the extent they can, but they're also not using energy as efficiently as they can either.
Yes, gentleman at front.
I was surprised at your omission of. Sorry, is this
Say who you are.
It's on. Sorry, no particular affiliation. I'm just a member of the public. I'm surprised at your lack of mention of nuclear possibly being important in this, because it's obviously logically possible and indeed physically possible to produce much more energy via nuclear, and indeed it's becoming economically possible with the new technologies coming through. So why so little mention of nuclear?
So,
Likewise, there's another field of new technology, graphene, with its impact on electrical storage and a lot of process improvements as well. Those two could be major components of this, and they're not in your analysis.
well, they are in my analysis. I only had, Stuart gave me 20 minutes to summarise my 100-page book. As I said, the share of nuclear energy has declined over the last 20 years, essentially following the Fukushima disaster. If you look ahead, our sort of broad trend over the next 20 years is that the share of nuclear energy continues to sort of gradually just trend down very slightly. But to first order, essentially, its share within the power sector is broadly flat. But that broadly flat share disguises two very strong contrasting trends. So on the one side is a declining share within the major markets within the OECD. So the major conventional the major markets of the past, the US, different parts of Europe, both the politics of nuclear and the economics of nuclear means that it's hard for it to compete in those countries. Many nuclear stations will hit 40, 50 years over the next 20 years, will be decommissioned, and our expectation is they will not be filled by new investment, and as a result they will decline. On the other side is China. China, we estimate, will increase the amount of nuclear power by around 1,000 terawatt hours over the next 20 years. So that's 4 or 5 new nuclear reactors coming on stream every year for the next 20 years. As it moves away from coal, all other forms of energy have to grow very rapidly. Massive growth in renewable energy in China, but also massive growth in nuclear energy. One of the reasons why nuclear energy hasn't carried on growing in recent years is its learning curve hasn't continued to be been steeply downward sloping. In fact, if anything, the learning curve has gone upwards, so the cost has increased over time. One of the exciting things about China, if it really can produce 4 or 5 nuclear reactors each year, is they get better and better at doing it. And as they get better and better at doing it, it may well be that some of those that improvements, that learning by doing, spills over into other countries. And so therefore the economics of nuclear more generally could improve. My hunch is the politics of nuclear in much of the OECD remains a pretty harsh environment, but you can imagine places in Asia, Middle East, Africa, where if the economics of nuclear improve, there'll be an absolute big demand for it. But the question is can what China what is happening in China, can those learnings sort of be taken across other parts of the world in terms of reducing unit costs?
Last question at the back.
Peter Dolan with ERC Equipoise. Following on in the same theme, do you feel, can you expand a little bit on the potential of bioenergy? Because although I don't know anything about it, it strikes me as though it's a science that has the opportunity for some kind of quantum leap.
Yeah, so this is where I really, as an economist, I'm getting well out of my depth. So in terms of biofuels, this is one area where if anything, technology has improved less quickly than we expected. So in terms of renewable energy, BP, like more or less every other forecasting organisation, has underestimated the growth of wind power and underestimated the growth of solar power every year for the last sort of 7 or 8, 9 years. On the other hand, going in the opposite direction, we've sort of overestimated the growth of biofuels because that second generation biofuels hasn't come through to the extent we can. I was in Brazil recently, and they were sort of saying about how they were trying to compete against nuclear power, solar power and wind power. And my argument to them is you don't need to compete. You can produce liquid fuels and so there will be sectors of the economy which can't be electrified, where it is there for you. And so the main holdback or obstacle for biofuels is not a demand side one, it's a supply side one. How much bioenergy can the world produce in an efficient way? So an obvious one of that is via sort of feedstock like sugarcane, but there are other ways of doing this. So BP, and I will stop here, BP has recently invested in a project where we take municipal waste in America. So this is just rubbish, people's rubbish. And then we convert that rubbish into biojet. And we can use that biojet to produce clean energy for aviation. That's an expensive process, but what's exciting about that, the feedstock you're using has a negative price. People pay you to take their rubbish away. And so I think lots of technologies where we're trying to find better ways and different ways of trying to create biofuels and particularly bioliquid fuels, I think is an important part of the sort of next 20 or 30 years. I should stop. Great. Thank you very much.